Only Steve knows. All right, we are back. So I want, I'm sure people will start to trickle in here in a second in the main room. We've got quite a few people watching online. So for all of those folks, thanks for coming back. We have, as one of our last two speakers of today, I was really excited to get Brother Timothy Hogan out here. Tim Hogan has been a student and a past master within several different esoteric organizations over the last 20 years. He studied and served as a leader within various branches of Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Martinism, and Templarism. He's a former editor and writer for the periodicals Lay Initiation, Adrian's Web, and Living Stones Magazine. He's also written several Masonic and written for several Masonic and occult topics. Timothy Hogan lectures around the world on various aspects of Western mystery traditions. He's spoken at lodges in every country except Antarctica and Australia. So anybody in Australia, get a hold of Tim. Tim currently serves as the Worldwide Grand Master of the Order of the Temple of Secret Initiates, OTSI, a Knight Templar lineage. He regularly works as a consultant in the entertainment industry and helping in track 2 diplomacy worldwide. So without any further delay, I want to introduce Brother Timothy Hogan.
Thanks, brother. So, brethren, I'm going to hang on to your hats because we're going to take a fast tour into some interesting Templar history and connect it with Masonry. I am going to be talking about a lot of things that aren't in standard history books, and I can tell you that the things I'm going to be speaking of are not recycled information that is being copied by everybody else who keeps using the same information. I've traveled all over the world exploring the subject. I've visited everything from libraries and secret archives to secret crypts and underground cool stuff, very Indiana Jonesy, to compile some of this information. And I'll show you photos of things that just most people don't even know of. Most people have never seen. So it's going to be a fun journey. But hang on, it'll be a lot of information. So. All right. First of all, I'm going to tell you that there's a standard narrative that's usually taught about the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar, the standard narrative is that the Knights Templar were a crusading order that were established in 1118 under Roman Catholic patronage. Their stated mission was to protect pilgrims that were going down to the Holy Land. They were known to have set up shop, as it were, in Jerusalem, down in an area that was said to be Solomon's stables, which was the whole reason why they got their name of the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. Because it was believed they were at the area of where Solomon's temple had been. They, while they were there, they were certainly protecting pilgrims. They were also got involved in conflicts in the area and some of the crusading that was happening. But they were also doing a lot of digging under the Temple Mount. Shortly after their founding, they grew in wealth and influence, and there began to be they became the first international almost like corporation, where they had commanderies and preceptories all over Europe. They set up banking systems. They set up farming systems. They had entire shipping lanes and where they were shipping pilgrims and shipping people. And then there started to be mistrust about their power and influence, because they only had to answer to the Pope. It was the only person they had to answer to. And by 1307, the King of France, Philip the Fair, he owed the Templars money, and he wanted to, and he probably wanted access to money that they had in order to fund future wars that he wanted to do. And he basically blackmailed the church, Pope Clement V at the time, and they, on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the Templar order was suppressed. It was declared no longer under Roman Catholic patronage and protection. And by 1314, the Grand Master of the order at the time, Jacques de Molay, as well as his Norman preceptor, Geoffrey de Charnay, were burnt at the stake just outside of Notre Dame Cathedral. And most historians say that was the end of the Templar order. Now, there have been Masonic historians over the years, particularly starting with John J. Robbins in his book Born in Blood, and then in the degrees themselves of Freemasonry, particularly in both the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, as well overseas in the Swedish Rite of Freemasonry, who have all made the claim that in the higher degrees of Freemasonry, that there is a connection between the Templar order and Freemasonry, and that when the Templar order was suppressed, it simply just went underground, repackaged itself, and turned itself into stonemason guilds, and became ultimately speculative Freemasonry. This is kind of the mythos that's put out there, and it's certainly one that I started looking into 25 years ago now, and I wanted to see if there was something to this. And so that's how I started researching this. Here's on the left here, this is the symbol, the Templar cross, the traditional symbol of the Templar cross. It's an equal-armed red cross, though its design has changed in different parts of the Templar history. It's always been an equal-armed cross that was red. On the right was the traditional Templar seal, which was two knights on one horse. It was said to represent the vow of poverty that the knights took, because when these people joined the Templar order, they agreed to give up everything they had to the Templar order and to basically become a subject of the Templar order to help in the cause of the Templar order. So it was considered a symbol of poverty, the two knights of one horse. However, it has been argued that there were deeper symbolic significance behind this emblem itself, including the fact that the two knights may have represented, amongst other things, a tradition associated with Saint Sergius and Bacchus in early Christian times, as well as the symbol for Gemini, which was, of course, two twins. And one of the other symbols for Gemini is 2 pillars. So if you look, 2 pillars together is actually also a symbol for Gemini. So the fact that you have the 2 knights on 1 horse is a symbol for Gemini, as well as 2 pillars is a symbol for Gemini. You know, you can start, right there, you can start to potentially connect a connection with some of the symbolism in Freemasonry. Here on the left, that's you know, an image of Jacques de Molay. He was declared to be the last Grand Master of the Templar Order while the order was under Templar, Roman Catholic patronage. However, there are numerous Templar lineages around the world who have insisted that the Templar Order, in fact, did not cease to exist with the last breath of Jacques de Molay, and that the Templar Order merely went underground and spread out and continued to exist in different forms and pass on the tradition in different forms. And so we will explore some of that some more too. Oh, by the way, middle here, this is the Templar flag. It's known as the Beauseant. It's black and white flag with the red Templar cross. Authors like John J. Robinson said, hey, you know, this black and white checkered was really the origin of what was to become the black and white checkered pavement that was found in the later cathedrals, and also emphasized within the myths of Solomon's Temple within modern Masonic traditions. And I'm not going to get into all of John J. Robinson's research, if you, but he's worth checking out if this subject interests you. Esoteric or hidden Templar traditions worldwide have stated emphatically that the Templar Order was not actually founded in 1118, that it was actually started as early as 1096 after the First Crusade, and that around the time of the First Crusade, and that one of the prime movers in it was a man by the name of Michael Selos, who was a great I don't know. He was kind of interested in everything. I mean, he was studying everything from astronomy to you know, how to build more perfect buildings, to herbology, to, you know, all kinds of other things like that. He resided in Constantinople. There was most of the Templars who formed the Templar Order all came from Templar families, or I'm sorry, came from families in southern France, in particular, in the areas that was called the Languedoc region, where we find a group known as the Albigensians, also known as the Cathars, and they were a Gnostic group. They were a Gnostic sect of Christianity. And when I say Gnostic, they were an alternative perspective of Christianity than what the Roman Church was practicing at the time. They believed that anybody, through their own efforts, could connect with the divine and have a gnosis or a divine knowledge of the divine, much like what you would describe as enlightenment in the Eastern traditions, in that you did not need a priest, you didn't need the intermediary of a priest to intercede on your behalf. Well, if you're the Roman Church, which at the time made its entire income off of having people pay priests to act as intermediaries between them and God. This was a dangerous idea because, there goes your revenue stream, right? If people start to believe that. So the Roman Church, the first crusade that they actually did was against other Christians in the Languedoc region of France and against the Cathars. And it was a very terrible, bloody, crusade. But what we do know is that the original Templars, most of the original Templars, they came from these Cathar, these Albigensian families, from areas of like Cordes and Toulouse, and areas down in Carcassonne, and then up in Troyes. The person who wrote the rule for the Templars was a man by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and he is featured here on the left. He was a Cistercian monk. He also did work with the Cistercian order, and there seemed to be a very close connection between the Templars and the Cistercians. So it was almost like the Templars were going down into the Holy Land, were getting information, getting artifacts, establishing connections, and bringing that information back to the Cistercians, who were translating it and trying to make sense of it and do something with it. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux himself was a very interesting guy because he was widely believed to also be practicing Druidism at the time. He was a Druid, amongst also being a Cistercian and this great representative for the Roman Church. And he wrote about, learning from the trees and the rocks and everything else. Hugh de Paynes, who was the first Grand Master of the Templars, who's in the middle here, he was actually the de Paynes family actually came from a Moorish background. They were Moorish Sufi background, actually, which is interesting because it's a Muslim background. So the first Grand Master of the Templars actually came from a Muslim family. And in fact, the de Payens coat of arms, our blazon, which of the family crest of the de Payens family, actually had depicted on it 3 Moors' heads. And it represented the family line of Hugh de Payens. Hugh de Payens was also married to Catherine de St. Clair. And the St. Clair family became what was to become the Sinclair family later on. And the Sinclair family had a very close relationship with Freemasonry and was also the builders and the custodians of Rosslyn Chapel, which was talked about in Dan Brown's book and other places. But the Sinclair family, or the St. Clair family, Hugh de Paynes was married to Catherine de St. Clair. Catherine de St. Clair was also the cousin of Chrétien de Troyes. And Chrétien de Troyes was the person who wrote the very first Grail legend in France, in the town of Troyes. So this is kind of interesting as well. Also within Troyes is where the Templar rule or Book of Constitutions was first developed and codified by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and given to the Templar order. And this rule is interesting because it was composed of 72 articles. And it is believed that each of these articles within the Templar rule corresponded to one of the 72 Kabbalistic names of God from the Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition. And St. Bernard of Clairvaux would have learned of this through Rashi of Troyes, who was a very famous Kabbalist who he was friends with within the town of Troyes. So we have a couple different things going on here. We have Bernard of Clairvaux is putting together the rule with these 72 articles. He's friends with Rashi of Troyes, this famous Kabbalist who lived in Troyes, and then Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote the very first Grail legends. He also lived in Troyes, and he was related to Hugh de Payens, who was the first Grand Master of the Templars. And Hugh de Payens came from this Sufi background. And the Sufi were, they were Gnostic Muslims. So just as there had been these Gnostic Christians down in southern France who had been persecuted and suppressed by the Roman Church, but who formed the first Templars, all came from this Gnostic Christian branch. The first Grand Master came from a family of Gnostic Muslims. So this suggests, like right at the very beginning of the founding of the Templar order, and then they were also working with Rashi with the Kabbalistic ideas, which were the Gnostic philosophies of Judaism. So very, very much right at the beginning of the founding of the Templar orders, you had Gnostic Christian, Gnostic Muslim, and Gnostic Jewish traditions coming together to form this order. On the right here, this is Michael Silos, who was widely credited with in 1096. He was said to be the initiator of Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint Omar, who were the first two of the first Templars. I mean, Hugh de Payens, who we just talked about, who was the first Grand Master. They went down to Constantinople, and they were initiated by Michael Silos. Michael Silos was said to belong to an order known as the Brothers of the East, which was said to have originally come out of Greece and made its way into Constantinople at the time, which is, of course, now Istanbul. So this is just a slide showing the a summary of some of what I just talked about. By the way, Rashi of Troyes, his full name was actually Shlomo Yazaki. So, all right. There is other little-known history, though, associated with the Templars. Oftentimes, modern historians are way too quick to just point out that the Templars were this crusading army trying to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, and just making it like that. I mean, this blank statement, even though that totally neglects the fact that Hugh de Payens' entire family came from this mystic branch of Islam. But there are other things, other documents which suggest that there was more close relationships between the early Templars and the Muslims that were already residing in Jerusalem at the time. For example, it's a little fact of lost history that the Egyptian Sultan General Salahuddin, who was he was the leader of the Islamic armies during the Crusade, but he was actually knighted into the Templar order around 1190. in a 13th century manuscript. It's a French work called the Ordre de Chivalry, or the Order of Chivalry. It was written in 1250. It historically documented an event in which Salahuddin was given and received the secret initiation ceremony of the Knights Templar. So again, this puts a very different spin on what was going on with the early Templar order than is what's being normally taught right now in books and on TV shows and everything else. I mean, it suggests that there was, if Salahuddin, the head of the Islamic army during the Crusades, had been initiated into the Templar order, it suggests that there was a special relationships between the Templar order and what was going on in the Holy Land at the time. And in fact, in the annals of the history of the Crusades in Jerusalem, that records this, has recorded the story of a young Frankish knight entering the Dome of the Rock and being met with a Muslim praying towards Mecca. Losing his Templar, he intimidated the Muslim who was praying, quote unquote, the wrong way. The Frankish knight then found himself taken to task by two Knights Templar who ordered him out of the holy precinct and told him not to come back until he had learned manners and tolerance. The Templars then, on behalf of the expulsed knight, apologized to the Muslim for the Frank's misgiving attitude. So therefore, these Templars were ignoring the directives from Rome and giving Muslims and Jews the right to pray any way they wanted to in Jerusalem. So this shows they weren't enforcing like, hey, you have to be Christian in order to be here. They were in fact promoting a level of tolerance, which was unheard of back then, and is still hard to be found in the world today. But when you understand the founding of the Templar Order and all those elements going into it, it begins to make a little more sense. I have visited the former Templar commandery in Istanbul, where Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de Saint Omar were initiated by Michael Selos, according to tradition. And I'm going to talk about this place a couple times in this presentation. So this is the first part, but I'll talk about it again later in the presentation. The building, which was originally called the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, it was built like a giant beehive. And this is where Michael Selos resided, and it's where Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de Saint Omar were initiated. And it said this is where the Templar Order was originally founded, and where they were sent to go down to Jerusalem to particularly find artifacts. Underneath, by the way, if you look at the slide here on the left, if you look at the top, you can kind of see the prayer turret. It's since this church has since been made a mosque, so it's maintained by Muslims now in Istanbul. But they've preserved a lot of the original architecture of the building, and they've tried to replicate some of the stuff. So actually, all the floor tiles of the building underneath the carpet are all honeycomb shape, because again, it was built to be like a giant beehive. And there's a secret crypt underneath this. It's now called the Little Hagia Sophia Mosque, even though it was originally called the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, and it was the Templar commandery. There is a secret crypt, Templar crypt, under this this building. I've been down in that crypt. And in that crypt, here on the right, you can see some of the graves that were down there, the remnants of some of the graves down there. In this crypt are buried Muslim, Jewish, and Christian Templars. all buried together. I can't emphasize enough how unusual it is. I mean, we still have people today, unless you're a Mason, where you're buried in the Masonic part of the cemetery, where, you know, we don't care what religion you are, we're all buried together as brothers. You know, people to this day still have themselves buried in, you know, different parts of the cemetery based on what religion they are. But here we are, Templar crypt at the bottom of the Templar commandery, that has Jewish, Christian, and Muslims, Templars, buried together under it. And here you can see the top part of a Templar cross. Here you see Hebrew grave. This is all down in that crypt underneath the Little Hagia Sophia Mosque, which was the former Templar commandery where Michael Selos initiated the Templars. Also, within this building that's built like a giant, beehive, is found the earliest depiction of the square and compasses in Europe that I've been able to find. And it's depicted as now keep in mind, Istanbul, or Constantinople back then, but Istanbul today, you can all get that song stuck in your head, it was original, you know, half of it is in Europe and half of it's in Asia. And the Bosphorus is what separates it. Well, on the tops of the pillars in this building is depicted a square and compasses next to an Egyptian ankh, right? And that dates back to the time of the Templars. That's pretty cool. And that's the earliest example of it that I've found. But the fact that it's in this building that was the former commandery of the Templars should emphasize that it was of special significance to them. The fact that there's this Egyptian ankh in there may allude to, well, I'm sure it alludes to part of the tradition that they were inheriting from some of the other groups in the area, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. Now, according to traditional rabbinical history within Judaism, Kabbalah is the mystical Gnostic branch of Judaism. And according to, and there are several different Kabbalistic texts. These are some of the most famous ones listed here on this slide. But according to early rabbinical traditions, two of these texts, the Sefer HaBehir and the Zohar, the original fragments of the Zohar, were actually discovered by the Templars in the Holy Land and brought back to Jewish communities in Spain. And the belief is that the Templars were, you know, they were digging under there in Jerusalem, near where they were at. Everyone speculates on what they found while they were digging there. I mean, to this day, if you go to Israel, you can still, the tunnels are still there, you know, from where they were doing all this digging. And in archaeological excavation. And one belief is that Rashi of Troyes, in conjunction with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, were working with the Templars, telling them where they needed to dig to find certain things that were believed to be there in the Holy Land. And some of these included these Kabbalistic texts. In fact, here's this is a written account by Rabbi David Joseph Chaim Azulay from 1755, and he records the following. Based on ancient Jewish records, the Zohar was found in the land of Israel by Muslim workers who were serving Christian Templar masters. The Muslim worker unearthed some clay jars. Keep in mind, this is the same thing that we find with the stories of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi library. They were also said to be found in these clay jars, right? But this was written in 1755, long before the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi library were found in the mid 1900s. Anyhow, the Muslim worker unearthed some clay jars, inside of which were some ancient scrolls. The worker then took the scrolls to his Christian master, who could not decipher them. The Christian master then went to a local but trusted rabbi, who was indeed able to recognize and decipher the scrolls, and thus the Zohar was discovered. The scrolls were then smuggled out of the Holy Land in Jewish hands, who traveled on a Templar ship. They made their way to Spain into the hands of Rabbi Moshe de Leon. It is allegedly he who then transcribed the scrolls and published the Zohar. It's kind of interesting, right? The same publisher who published the Zohar for the first time was the publisher who also published the Grail story, Parzival, for the first time by Wolfram von Eschenbach. And Wolfram von Eschenbach was also said to be a Templar. He said he learned the story through a Giat of Provence, or a Kiat of Provence. We know who Kiat of Provence was. Kiat of Provence was Giat of Provence, and he was a Knight Templar. And in this Grail story, they say that the Templars were the guardian of the Holy Grail. So it's interesting that at the same time when Parzival was published, the Zohar was published for the first time, both by the same publisher in Spain, and both have this connection to the Templar order. By the way, the Zohar was originally said to have been written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. I have traveled to Israel, again, tracking some of this stuff down. This is me actually opening the tomb. It's a photo of me opening the tomb of Shimon Bar Yochai. It was a great honor to be able to do that. The Orthodox community in Israel is not even allowed to go in that tomb. So it was really, really quite an honor. But it was because of what I knew about all this. They even let me in. So the Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition, and I could give there's a lot of the topics I'm talking about right now that I could give entire lectures on. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to summarize some things because we need to understand how they might relate to Freemasonry. The Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition basically says that the Hebrew alphabet is a symbolic alphabet. It's composed of 22 letters, and each letter represents different things. And so the entire Torah is written in code. And you can't really understand the Torah unless you understand the code behind the letters. And some of this is alphanumeric stuff. Some of it is astrological stuff. Some of it is just symbolic ideas. But the 22 letters represented aspects of God's consciousness manifesting in the world, essentially. They also said that the entire universe was organized according to something known as the Tree of Life, which was composed of 10 emanations or qualities of God's consciousness manifesting in the world, and that these were connected by 22 paths. Each of these 22 paths corresponded to one of the Hebrew letters, and that there was a hidden another point within this diagram that brought about manifestation of consciousness and the human body and everything else, thus forming 32 points of manifestation with a hidden 33rd. So there were 33 aspects of God's consciousness that manifested in the world, and they were organized onto 3 pillars, 3 vertical pillars. And these 3 vertical pillars corresponded to wisdom, strength, and beauty. Okay, this is the Kabbalistic tradition, which should sound familiar to everybody here. There were also levels. There were 3 main levels that you had to go up this Kabbalistic tree. The first corresponded with water. The second corresponded with air. The third corresponded with fire. I want you to think about the penalties of your obligation for each of the 3 degrees. It's the same thing. Okay. And it shouldn't be too. Some would argue, oh well, it's not too surprising that we find Kabbalistic stuff in Masonry because the great historian Trevor Stewart of the Quattrocornati Lodge and in England, he wrote extensively on this. He pointed out that the founders of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717 all belonged to a group known as the Kabbalah Club, where they were studying these Kabbalistic things, you know. But you still need to ask, well, why were all these people that were forming the Grand Lodge of England attracted to Kabbalah to begin with? And why did they feel it was so important to tie it in with Freemasonry? And it could be this early Templar connection. And we'll explore that some more. Within the Kabbalistic tradition, they also depicted this Kabbalistic tree as representing a cup, which some people have believed that is really the origin of the Holy Grail being represented as a cup. In fact, the first line in the Zohar, it says, and this secret is written about in the verse, I will raise up the cup of salvation, for this is the cup of benediction that is raised after the meal. The cup of benediction must rest on 5 fingers and no more, just as a lily rests on 5 rigid leaves that represents 5 fingers. And this is the lily is the cup of benediction. So here we have again, we can kind of connect why when the Templars, again, according to traditional Kabbalistic sources, brought the Zohar to Spain, to Jewish communities in Spain, why the same publishers that were publishing Parzival, this first Grail story that said that the Templars were the guardians of the Holy Grail, were also publishing the Zohar. And we find the same symbolism in both. Another symbol that was often used by the Templars, especially the hierarchy of the Templars, which we also find within Freemasonry today in the higher degrees of all the rites, is known as the Cross of Lorraine. It's basically like a vertical pillar line with 3 horizontal pillars. The origin of that symbol comes from this Kabbalistic Tree of Life diagram. Represented the middle pillar and then the 3 steps up that middle pillar. Okay, that's the origin of it. So it was used by the early Templars, still used by Masonic, both York Rite, Scottish Rite, and Swedish Rites to this day, as well as a number of other appendant bodies within Freemasonry. By the way, that Kabbalistic tree itself was also known as the Parsu. It's also known as Parsuf in Hebrew. Parsuf just means face in Hebrew. The article El in Hebrew means God. So the Parsuf El is the face of God. And of course, that's also the origin of the name Parsival, right? Which was the name of this story, of this first Grail story that said that the Templars were the guardians of the Grail. I'm going to move on from that. There's a lot more to it. The Zohar talks about a number of things in it. It talks about how the earth is round and how there are 7 continents and that there's one continent where there aren't any people on it, and all of this stuff long before it was discovered. And it may be that when the Templars were suppressed in 1307, one of the places that they continued to survive was within a group known as the Knights of Christ in Portugal. And the Knights of Christ became the early explorers and navigators of the world. And it's believed by some, for example, that they were, in fact, influenced by these ideas in the Zohar, which was talking about all this, and where the Zohar got all this information. It's believed that maybe it was passed down in secret libraries from an earlier civilization that understood this stuff before it was wiped out in a flood. So, all right. So, and this just shows some of the famous Knights of Christ, who were again the Templars surviving after the suppression, who were also famous navigators. By the way, Christopher Columbus's father-in-law was also a Templar, and when Christopher Columbus he figured out that there was something probably going on the other side of the Atlantic, likely because the Templars were already traveling to the New World. And so what he did is he went and he pulled, Christopher Columbus's father-in-law was the Grand Master of the Knights of Christ. And when he died, his daughter went into a convent and took with her a bunch of things that her father had passed on to him. So what did Christopher Columbus do? He went and he basically yanked her out of the convent, married her, and then went to Portugal and was like, hey, fund me to go to the New World. I know there's stuff over there. And Portugal was like, F you. We already know there's stuff over there. We've been protecting the Knights of Christ who've been going over there, so we're not going to help you. So Columbus was like, fine, then I'm going to go to your enemy and get them to fund me. So he went to Spain, and that's probably a true story of what was really happening. And he knew that the Templars were coming over here, which is why and already had established relations with the natives in the area, which is the whole reason why he started flying the Templar cross on his ships, because he knew that the natives would recognize it, because there's already those relationships going on. All right. Within all of this tradition, we also find manifestations of the god Hermes. Hermes was the Egyptian Thoth or Tahuti. He was the Roman Mercury, the Sumerian Enki, the Phoenician Tuat, the Norse Wotan, and he was the Hebrew Hiram. If you take Hermes in Hebrew or in Greek and transliterate it into Hebrew, Hebrew doesn't have any really written vowels, they're implied vowels. So if you put a different emphasis on the consonants HRM, which would be from going from Greek Hermi to HRM in Hebrew, then you put a different emphasis on it, HRM becomes Hiram. Okay, so that's how that happened, right? We know that one of the groups that the Templars were associating with and had very close associations with in the Middle East were a group known as the Tawhid Muhadun, which are more popularly known as the Druze. The Druze are a secret society. They say that they're a semi-secret society. They're their religion. They have initiation rites. They believe that they were the builders of King Solomon's temple. They say that they originally came from, they believe in reincarnation. They venerate Hermes and Pythagoras as prophets. And they say that they originally came from Egypt, and that what happened was Enoch created two pillars to incorporate all the knowledge of the ancient world in them, and that there was a great flood, and that this knowledge was preserved in these pillars, and that the Druze people retained this knowledge from the pillars in Egypt, and from there they went on to start to rebuild civilization. That's what the Druze myth is, which should sound familiar to people, right? But this is what the Druze teach, right? And the Templars had this special associations with the Druze. The Templars were also working with the Sabaeans. The Sabaeans were, they also venerated Hermes. They actually worshipped Hermes. And in fact, when the Muslims came across the Sabaeans, the Muslims said, you can't worship Hermes. And they're like, well, that's who we worship. And so the Muslims said, well, we'll just call Hermes Idris, and we'll say that you're worshiping Idris, and that's okay. So you can be considered people of the book, which is accepted. So even within the Quran to this day, it says that the people of the book are the people that are okay, are the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Sabaeans, according to the Quran. So, but the Templars were working with the Druze and the Sabaeans, and the Druze and the Sabaeans also had close relationships. Both were passing on and discussing works associated with Hermes. Hermes is also found in Codex 4 of the Nag Hammadi Library. So for those who aren't familiar with the Nag Hammadi Library, there's a series of texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in clay jars that have some of which tell alternative gospels to the Bible. So there are both what we consider Old Testament or Torah, and New Testament Gospels that were found in the Nag Hammadi Library, as well as the writings of Hermes, thus strongly suggesting that these early Christians were also studying Hermetic ideas. So just like the Druze and the Sabaeans, who the Templars were working with. Hermes is most associated with a book known as the Corpus Hermeticum, which was actually given to the de Medici family during the Renaissance, and it was largely believed to have come from Druze. That's where it originally came from, who were preserving it. The symbol for the Druze, by the way, is this 5-pointed star. If that looks familiar to the Eastern Star logo. It's because Morris, who created the Eastern Star logo, he spent time in the Holy Land. In fact, he wrote a book called, I think, Journey to the Holy Land was the name of the book, where he talked about encountering with different groups in the Middle East, including the Druze. And so he just adopted it for Freemasonry. But originally it was a Druze symbol. The Druze still use it. That star represents the five. In the Druze tradition, it represents the five. It represents how gnosis, or direct knowledge of God, manifested in the world. And it represents the 5 points of their fellowship. It's called the 5 points of their fellowship. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival is also mentioned Hermes Trismegistus. He's found in a character known as Trevisrent, the hermit. And the word hermit comes from Hermes, and Trevisment means threefold knower. So this character in the book Parzival is in fact Hermes Trismegistus, who also means Hermes, the thricefold knower. So that's really the origin of that. And this whole idea of as above, so below in Hermetic texts is also found in it. So, and it's probably because they were all associating with each other, and the Templars were aware of this. Later, Sir Isaac Newton published another text of the Hermetic text known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which you can look into if you're, but there's some close associations with Masonic ritual in it. Here's what Wolfram von Eschenbach says about the Templars and the Grail. He says, "The Grail is well known to me. Many formidable fighting men dwell at Mount Salvage," which means the mountain of salvation, "with the Grail. They are continually riding out on sorties in quest of adventure. Whether these same Templars reap trouble or renown, they bear it for their sins. A warlike company lives there, and I'll tell you how they are nourished. They live from a stone whose essence is most pure. If you've never heard of it, I shall name it for you here. It is called Lapsit Exilis. By virtue of this stone, the phoenix is burned to ashes, in which he is reborn. Thus does the phoenix molt its feathers, which done, it shines dazzling bright and lovely as before. Further, however ill a mortal may be, from the day on which he sees the stone, he cannot die for that week, nor does he lose his color. For if anyone, maid or man, were to look at the Grail for 200 years, you would have to admit that his color was as fresh as in his early prime, except that his hair would gray. Such powers does the stone confer on mortal men, that their flesh and bones are made young again. This stone is also called the Grail." So in here we have the Grail being associated with alchemy, and of course Hermes was considered the father of alchemy, and it suggests that there was this alchemical tradition. And in fact, we know that the Druze to this day continues to practice alchemy. And we also know that the Templars back in the day were also messing with alchemy and doing things with alchemy. In fact, in 1245, William de Sonac became the Sovereign Grand Master of the Templar Order in Jerusalem. Later in 1247, Brother William de Sonac sent a distinguished Knight Templar delegation to England in order to present King Henry III a portion of the blood of our Lord, which he shed on the cross with the salvation of the planet enclosed in a handsome crystalline vessel. The relic was authenticated beneath the seal from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the bishops, abbots, nobles of the Holy Land. The sacred vessel was called the Chalice of the Rose Cross, and it contained a rare hermetic and alchemical elixir, which was called the blood of Christ or the Red Lion. This vessel was passed into the possession of Henry IV, King of Navarre, The vessel and its contents were later deposited in the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. So we know the Templars were messing around with alchemy. We have the historical record of it. They were also known for developing antibiotics, like long before we associate with antibiotics. They were using certain mold extracts to help heal people in the Holy Land, and it was believed that they learned of this from the Druze who they were associating with. There is a Templar rule, which again is like the Book of Constitutions for the Templars. It's dated 1240, and it says in Article 8, there are elected brothers and consoled brothers throughout the world. Where you see tall buildings built, make the signs of recognition, and you will find many righteous men with knowledge of God and the great art. They have received it from their fathers and masters and are all brothers. Among them are the good men of Toulouse, the poor of Lyon, the Albigensian, those near Verona and Bergamo, the Bahali of Galicia and Tuscany, the Bulgars and the Bulgarians. By the way, these are all Gnostic groups. Every one of these groups were Gnostic groups that were standing in contrast to the Church of Rome that the Templar order was supposedly working for. But here they are saying that the Templars have a special relationship with these Gnostic groups. You will lead them to your chapters by underground passages, and for those who are fearful, you will give them the consolamentum outside the chapter before 3 witnesses. And then in Article 9 it says, you will see fraternally the brothers of these groups, and in the same way the consoled of Spain and Cyprus will fraternally receive the Saracen, the Druze, and those who live in Lebanon. So again, here's a Templar rule saying, hey, we have this special relationship with these Gnostic groups. Not only that, but we have special forms of recognition. We have secret words, and we have secret chambers where we receive each other and do ceremonies with them. That's pretty far out. So who were, and by the way, this is one of the early Templar seals. It's a figure of Abraxas. Abraxas was a Gnostic talisman. It was a rooster-headed figure of this person, this being wearing an apron. It had snake legs, a whip, a shield, 7 stars, and the letters iota, alpha, and omega, or I, A, and O. And this shows definitively that the Templars had this secret Gnostic tradition going on it. And the Gnostics had rites of purification, initiation rites of purification, in which they baptized people with water and then air and then fire at different stages of consciousness awakening and development. They were known as the religion of light. They called themselves the Sons of Light. And they had secret grips, secret words that were designed to help them pass what were known as archons or wardens, whose job was to test them. And if they could give these grips and words and signs, then it proved that they could get past them to the next level of awakening. This is something that's very, very, hang on a second. This is something that's very, very similar to what we find, obviously, within Freemasonry today. And it's exactly what that Templar rule is talking about, that there were these secret grips, words, signs that were being exchanged amongst these Gnostics, who had these initiation rites where and by the way, this body of Abraxas represented these initiation rites. The initiation rites were divided according to the elements of earth, water, air, and fire. So the snake legs represented the area of earth, and it represented the profanes, what the Gnostics would call the hylics, which was people that were just obsessed with physical stuff and their physical senses. And just as a snake crawls closest to the earth, that was the earth stage. The apron at the abdomen was at the level of the water stage, where the abdomen's where the liquid functions of the body take place. And so that was the water stage, and that's where there was a baptism by water. And the Gnostics said at that stage you had to learn to subdue your passions. This was really the first stage of initiation. And they said you had to learn to use your emotions as a force for change instead of drowning in them. And so they said the metaphors of walking on water was associated with this, that it was a metaphor. How can you stable your emotions so you don't sink in them, so you don't drown in them? Right? And this was the first stage of initiation, and subduing the passions. The next stage was the area of the air, which was at the chest. And this is, of course, where you take in the air into the lungs. But this is also where we find the whip that he holds, which cracks in the air. And that was the whip of knowledge. And it was at this stage that the Gnostics studied the arts and sciences, which they believed were all parts of the consciousness of the great architect. And if we could understand the signatures of the great architect, that we would come to understand his mind. We would get closer to gnosis. And then the last stage was, of course, the rooster head. And the rooster represented the fire stage, because the rooster calls out to the sun when it sees the light of the first day. And this represented the awakening to gnosis, or divine knowledge. The 7 stars going up the side represented the 7 seals, or the 7, in the Eastern tradition, what would be known as the 7 chakra, the 7 psychic centers, each of which was closed by one of the 7 deadly sins, but could be opened through the working the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 heavenly virtues. So the 3 heavenly virtues were faith, hope, and charity. The 4 cardinal virtues were prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. So like prudence overcame lust, temperance overcame gluttony, and so on and so forth. This was all part of the early Templar and Gnostic tradition. And the IAO represented the secret Gnostic name of God. And that could be a whole nother lecture. We're not going to go there. But here's a diagram of the elements and how they corresponded to the baptismal rites of the Gnostics. They also corresponded to the stages of alchemical transformation in the lab. And of course, groups like the Druze continue to this day to pass on alchemical knowledge related to this. They still continue to do alchemy. And they're obviously passing this on to the Templars and people like Isaac Newton, who, by the way, was best friends with Jean Theophilus Duzegalier, the 3rd Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, who many believe established the third degree as standard within Freemasonry. He was best friends with Duzegalier. They used to do alchemy together. Duzegalier was an alchemist. So that's how he and Newton knew each other. They're both in the royal side together. So, so there's these connections. Here's a Druze temple in Lebanon that I visited. Again, there's the 5-pointed star. The Druze, this is very important to point out. Well, first of all, I'm going to preface this by saying I believe, and this is my belief, okay? This is not dogma in Masonry. But I believe that there has always been a Master Mason degree that has existed, but it was reserved for masters of lodges. And it wasn't until the like 1723 through the mid 1700s that the Grand Lodge of England kind of opened this up to any brother of the craft within the lodge. Because in the earliest documents, we have reference, Masonic documents, we have reference to a master's word, we have reference to a master grip. There's just no talk about a master initiation, but there had to have been a master initiation for this. And it makes sense that it was reserved for masters of lodges. Well, the Druze have a grip that's given to those who have been initiated into the way within the Druze initiation rites. To this day, they continue to pass it on. And it's done by what the Druze say you get on this, according to the Druze. Now, I'm not talking about Freemasonry necessarily here, so I want you to listen carefully. According to the Druze, you have to get on what are known as the 5 points of fellowship, each of which corresponds to the 5 points of their star. They were the 5 points of how gnosis manifested in the world. And you gave a grip, which is identical to the strong grip of a Master Mason that we give today, only they put a cloth over the hand, a sacred cloth, and then they say the word Mohabin. Mohabin in Arabic means welcome to the place of the heart. And it comes from the Arabic word mahaba, which means to love. So you think about, where were you first prepared to be made a Mason? Right? Welcome to the place of the heart, brother. Okay? So this is what the Druze continue to do to this day. Now, who were the only people that were traveling between the Middle East and Scotland that could have passed on something like this? It was the Templars. They're the only ones that had connections with the Sinclair family. Catherine de Sinclair was, again, the wife of Hugh de Payens, the first Grand Master of the Templars. And they had special relationship with the Druze that had these rites, which continue to be passed on to this day. Which suggests strongly that the Templars inherited this from the Druze. Brought it up to Scotland, where it made its way into English Masonry and French Masonry and German Masonry, and it continues to be passed down in different forms to this day. Tawhid, the Druze, again, al-Tawhid just means the oneness of being. Again, that's their Gnostic tradition. This is on the left here. This is me meeting with the Druze in Lebanon. They wear white caps that look just like the Scottish Rite 33rd degree caps, pretty much. This is how they pray, right? Much like we find within the Scottish Rite, with the arms crossed and the sign of the Good Shepherd. And on the right here, this is Walid Jumblat. He's the current Grand Master of the Druze, who I've also met with, and exchanged these grips. Okay, so we're not talking theory here. We're not like this isn't just coming from reading books. This is like practically, I've met with these people. I've prayed in the Druze temples. Interestingly, the Druze temples usually also feature St. George slaying a dragon, which is an unusual thing to find in the Middle East. But the Druze are found all throughout the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, even in Israel. In fact, they're the only religion that's allowed to serve in the Israeli army other than Judaism, because the Druze teach that you are to conform to the outer practices of whatever country you live in, but secretly you practice the doctrines and the initiation rites. Sound kind of familiar? All right. The other group, the Sufi, who I've also met with in Turkey and in Cyprus. In fact, I met with Sheikh Nazim Kabrisi, who is the Grand Master of the Druze in Cyprus. He's since passed away. The Sufi, they're most known for their dervishes. They wear these giant fezzes, which are kind of like Shriner fezzes on steroids. But these giant fezzes represent tombstones, Islamic tombstones, because they say they have symbolically died to this world and then been raised to the new light of understanding. The Sufi, they wear these white robes, and then over it they wear these black cloaks that represent a cloak of invisibility that allows them to hide in the world. When they're in their tekkes or lodges, they remove the cloak invisibility so that they can practice their art. They place a white lamb skin in the east of the temple. They have officers in the east, the south, and the west. They have an opening ceremony that talks about the position of the sun throughout the day. They light a candle in the center on an altar in the center of the tekke, and they begin to do their practice. And part of their practice also involves giving certain signs. And the Sufi signs are, the first is called the Si sign, which is this. The second is called the Sa sign, which is this. And the third is called the So sign, which is this across the abdomen. This probably should look familiar to Masons. And when they do it, the neck sign is C, Z, Z, C, 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 C. They chant it. The chest is the Sa sign, Sa, 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 Sa. And the abdomen, across the abdomen is So, 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 So. The Z represents the activating force of these vowels of I, A, and O. The Gnostic name of God that we find on the Templar seals. It's the same thing. They also put their hand in this shape, which is the same shape you have to put your hand in to give the Druze grip. And it's one we find in Freemasonry, and is what's found in the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition associated with the Hebrew letter Shin, which is fire. And you'll find Jewish priests giving a blessing with their hand in this shape. The Sufi will take this and they'll put it over their heart. And they call this the star sign. So they put it over their heart. They also will form, at the end of their tekkes ceremonies, they'll form a chain of union where they all link arms around the candle in the center, and they give their blessings to send everybody out, and they spiral out of the teke, out of the lodge. Pretty cool stuff, right? I mean, very familiar to anyone who's a Mason. These are things that we find within the Masonic rites. Well, this is the other group that the Templars are associated. This was the line that Hugh de Payens, the first Grand Master of the Templars, was associating with. So here we have this connection. The Templars, or the Sufi, also practice alchemical traditions. In fact, these are some early Sufi Templar or Sufi alchemical manuscripts. So just like the Druze, they were also practicing alchemy. Again, here's some more. And they were translating Greek and Roman alchemical texts into Arabic, and the Templars gathered this, brought it back to Europe, and started to incorporate it into the Gothic structures of Europe. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. The Templars, again, most people think of them as just like knights, right? Crusaders. But they also had ship captains, they had farmers, they had bankers, and they also had stonemasons. In fact, they were responsible for building the first cathedrals of Europe. And standard historians say that the cathedral builders were the companions, which is true. But the companions were composed of two bodies. They were known as the children of Solomon and the children of the Master Jacques. And according to both of these companion traditions, which still exist to this day, they both say that they were the building force of the Knights Templar. And that the children of Solomon just came from the children of the poor Knights of Christ, so the Templar of Solomon, which was the complete name of the Templars. The children of the Master Jacques got their name from the children of Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars who were burnt at the stake. So both of these groups say that they were the original building force of the Templars. And we find things within the cathedrals that are only found in these early Druze and Sufi alchemical texts. As for example, at the bottom left here, this is an old Druze alchemical manuscript. This is said to be the Labyrinth of Solomon. The first place that we find that in Europe, other than this rare alchemical manuscript, is on the floor of Chartres Cathedral. That's where it came from. So on the right here, you see Chartres Cathedral. You also find things like up here on the left, top left, you find this is a diagram, a Druze diagram of the tree of alchemy. On the right, on the left is Basil Valentine's, who is a very famous alchemist. His diagram of the tree of alchemy, he was alive during some people believe he was a Templar. On the right is the Druze original of that same diagram. So you can see where he got it from. You can see this was being shared. This esoteric knowledge is being shared. Also, we find in alchemical manuscripts from the 1500s on where the origins of alchemy came from. This is a diagram up here on the left. The first person listed, Michael Selos. That's the guy who initiated Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint Omar. What's he doing being listed in an alchemical manuscript of the 1500s? As well as a number of Druze and Sufi Arab alchemists that were all associated with the Templars. right? So we could see the tradition. Now, here's the Templar rule of 1268, number 325. It says, no brother should ever swear when angry or calm. I'd be in trouble with that one. Nor should they ever say an ugly or vile word, even less do such a thing. Every brother is required to do all noble actions and say all good words. No brother should wear leather gloves, except the chaplain brothers, who are permitted to wear them in honor of our Lord's body, which was the host at communion, which they often hold in their hands. And the Templar Mason brothers may wear them sometimes, but they should not wear them when not at work. So here's the rule of the Templars, specifically talking about the Masonic, the Masons within the Templar body, and their use of wearing leather gloves. Also in these cathedrals, we start to find signatures which point to this tradition, which can only be found in the Middle East, and yet they're showing up on the cathedrals. And the only people that were going back and forth between the Middle East and Europe who had a building force were the Templars. One of which, and this will show up in a Dan Brown book someday, if you go to Chartres Cathedral in France, there's a stained glass window that's dedicated to Saint Apollo. It's kind of weird, right? Because Apollo is the sun. There was no Saint Apollo. But it has a little tiny hole in it. And on the ground, the floor tiles of the cathedral are all tiled going one direction except for one stone. And that one stone has a little brass peg in it. And on St. John the Baptist's Day, a ray of light comes in that window, hits that peg, and between the ray of light, the floor, and the wall, it forms a giant 3-4-5 triangle. Well, that's pretty cool. Again, on St. John the Baptist's Day. And of course, the Saints John were significant to the Gnostics and to the Templars because they represented a Johannite lineage, a lineage of leaders calling themselves John, because it was a secret Gnostic name of God that composed the letters I, A, and O. John in English comes from Johannes in German, which comes from Ioannis in Greek. And Ioannis was emphasizing the letters I, A, and O. Gnostic name for God. Also, we find astrological information in these cathedrals, starry decked canopies, and alchemical information incorporated in the cathedrals. This is the front of Notre Dame Cathedral. We have a figure of holding a shield with a salamander on fire. You show me in the Bible where there's a salamander on fire. Why is this being incorporated on the cathedral? Here we have Hermes with his wand, with the snake going up it, what was called the Hermes wand. Again, being depicted on the front outer porch of Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris. Other ones, you have Hermes himself being depicted in the cathedrals. This one's in Vienna. Again, Notre Dame Cathedral. The highest point on the cathedral is not Jesus. You don't find a statue of Jesus. You find a statue of an alchemist wearing his Phrygian cap. That's pretty interesting. Things like the pelican, which was a symbol for an alchemical vessel during the Middle Ages, was known as a pelican. This is at Amiens Cathedral in France. Here you see a figure holding an Athanor oven, pulling a salamander out of it.
And they would work with wordplay. Salamander actually came from sal, which is salt, and mandra, which meant stable. And so it was a word play, and when you calcinate things down, you can extract the stable salts out of them. So that's really what salamander represented. But again, right in the cathedral. So these were ideas that were only being studied, written about, translated by the Druze and the Sufi in the Middle East, who the Templars were associated with, and then they're showing up on the cathedrals that the Templars were building. There's also astrological information in the stained glass, all of which was made alchemically using different metallic salts and such. And you have the emphasis on the outside of these cathedrals of things like Melchizedek, Pythagoras being depicted. This is at Chartres Cathedral. You have Pythagoras being depicted, 7 liberal arts and sciences, so on and so forth. Now I'm going to move forward. We're going to finish up here. I'm going to move forward quickly. The Templar tradition after 1307 continued to survive. And we know this because not only the Knights of Christ in Portugal, but if we go to Germany, in the area of the Black Forest, of the county or state of Württemberg, there's where you find places like Tübingen and Kauf and Bad Tainach and in other areas like this, we find these secret churches that were all associated with a guy by the name of Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg, who is said to be the Grand Master of an order known as the Militia Crucifera Evangelica, which was this Templar order that was continuing to exist in Germany. And this was their symbol. In fact, this was on the doorknob of one of their churches. It was the eye in the triangle with the square in the circle. That's me holding those doorknobs, right? This is the crypt for the Militia Crucifera Evangelica. You can still see the Templar crosses on the wall. Continue to exist. In 1604, in 1598, there was a book written called the Neometria. Neometria just means measurement of the temple. And it was dedicated to the Militia Crucifera Evangelica and the Grand Master Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg. Also, Queen Elizabeth I was also a member of the Militia Crucifera Evangelica, which is pretty interesting. And according to some esoteric traditions, Francis Bacon was actually her son, who was hidden at birth. That's a whole nother lecture. But here we have this connection right here with the Neometria. It means measurement of the temple. What it is it's a 2,000-page book describing the dimensions of King Solomon's temple and what those dimensions mean from a sacred geometry, Gnostic, Kabbalistic, and alchemical standpoint. In 1598, this was written by Simon Studion. It was published in 1604. We're talking almost 100 years before the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. These ideas are going around, right? This is Frederick right here on the left. That's his tomb up above. I've been there, looked at all this stuff. Now, it also came out of this Militia Crucifera Evangelica was a number of members of this group, including a man by the name of Johann Valentin Andrea, who wrote the first Rosicrucian manifestos in Germany. So that entire Rosicrucian movement came out of this Templar movement that was existing in Germany. And that's going to be a whole nother lecture too. I'm going to pass on. This is me. This is actually Johann Valentin Andrea's house in Kauf, in the church there with the Grail that's depicted. His mother was the town alchemist. This is a little plaque outside the house that says Maria Andrea worked as an acknowledged healer and headed a charity hospital at the court in Stuttgart from 1622 until her death. She lived with her son, Superintendent Johann Valentin Andrea, at the old Superintendent's District building in Kalf. By the way, Hermann Hesse, if you're interested in Hermann Hesse at all, he was also lived in Kalf. He lived right across the street from where Johann Valentin Andrea lived. And he wrote a book called Journey to the East, which is worth reading if you're Freemason. This is the Stift where this Militia Crucifera Evangelica did their research, held their meetings in the area, in Tübingen. And this is also where people like Kepler and Copernicus and others went to school. So, and this is also where Johann Valentin Andrea went to school, by the way. In the town, one of the towns nearby, there's a old Militia Crucifera Evangelica chapel, this Templar chapel, that was built by Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg. And hidden inside this chapel is a giant tracing board that's about 6 feet by 12 feet. And what it is and this is a key to it, it's hidden behind another painting. And what it is it's a depiction of all of the ideas in the Neometria. And what it has King Solomon's temple depicted with the pillars, and it has all of the alchemical, Gnostic, and Kabbalistic ideas depicted in it. It's set up according to the Kabbalistic tree of life. And also contained within it, it starts out with the young initiate, which in this case is Frederick's daughter, Princess Antonia, holding the symbols of faith, hope, and charity in the burning heart. And she's going in to be initiated through the painting. And as you walk up through the painting, it shows all of the different, stages of the Kabbalistic tree and the things in the painting. And it has things like Solomon with a checkered pavement, by the way. This is the earliest depiction. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that King Solomon's temple had a checkered pavement, but here it is in the painting from 1604. It has people like Nicholas Flamel in it, who was a very famous alchemist. It has people like Pythagoras depicted in it. Here's Jachin and Boaz. And, it's pretty amazing. At the top of the painting, of course, is the same symbol of the eye and the triangle with the squared circle. And also, you can't really see it because it's in the shadow up there. There's a crown with the letters I, A, and O as the monogram for God. Pretty cool. Again, the Gnostic name of God. And at the top of that crown, this is at Keter, which should be called Keter at the Kabbalistic tree. You find the Yod in a triangle. Earliest depiction of the Yod in the triangle that I've been able to find within anything. Of course, this is what's given. This is on the 14th degree ring within the Scottish Rite. But here it is, 1604. Everything that we find within Freemasonry is depicted in this painting, 1604 in Germany, being perpetuated and preserved by this underground Templar body. Pretty cool stuff. Now, this gave birth to what was known as the Rosicrucian movement. I'm not going to get into that. But I do want to, then the last part, I just want to backtrack a little bit. So again, remember the Sinclair family, Sinclair, that Hugh de Payne's married into. They're the ones who built Rosalind Chapel. We can't give this lecture without talking a little bit about Rosalind Chapel. Depicted at Rosalind Chapel are things suggesting a Templar connection and suggesting things that we are used to within Masonic initiation. Here we have a Templar on the left. And it's hard to see, but he actually has the Templar cross on his tunic. He has a cable tow around a person he's initiating who's blindfolded. They're between two pillars. And it's depicting this initiation ceremony, again, from the time of the Templars, right? This Rosslyn Chapel was completed in 1420. By the Sinclair family, passing on this tradition. However, also at Rosslyn Chapel, and this is the point that is so significant, and to anybody who says there is no evidence that there was a connection between the Templars and Rosslyn Chapel, I need them to explain this. So also at Rosslyn Chapel are depicted these angels that are playing notes. And above the angels' heads are these cubes with these designs on them, these geometric designs. And for a long time, people were trying to figure out what are these designs. We know what notes they're playing. What they are is here's the cubes with these designs. Again, angel playing a note, and then the cubes above them. What we know what they are is they're somatic music designs. And what somatic music designs are is you could take a drum, you could put sand on it, you can hook it up to like a tube, up to an instrument, and if you play a note on that instrument, the sand on the drum will organize itself according to geometric patterns. So this is something that supposedly wasn't discovered till the 1800s. Clearly, the people at Rosslyn Chapel understood this because they incorporated it into the architecture. There's some more of them. The only other place in the world where we find these same somatic music designs being incorporated in architecture is the former Templar commandery in Constantinople, and it's found on the ceiling ledges of that commandery. Again, built like a giant beehive. By the way, the earliest working beehive in architecture in Europe is found on top of Rosslyn Chapel. So here we have the little Hagia Sophia Mosque, the former Templar commandery, built like a giant beehive, and at Rosslyn Chapel we have this beehive. And by the way, on the top here, this is Templar. On the top here, this is again. This is that little Hagia Sophia Mosque in Istanbul. This kind of from up above, you can see the prayer turret in particular with the honeycomb, but you can also see kind of under the carpet, you can see the floor tiles still with the honeycomb. Here is, again, that former Templar commandery in Istanbul, and Templar Church in London was built to mimic it. So it has the same architecture, same layout, and everything. So there we have it. The last thing I want to point out here is the earliest documents of Freemasonry. The earliest document we have of Freemasonry comes from the mid-1300s. It's known as the Gothic manuscript. And it's talking about the origin of Freemasonry. And this is what it says. It talks about these special stones. It says, the one stone was called marble that cannot burn with fire. The other was called laterus that cannot drown with fire. Our intent is to now tell you truly in what manner these stones were found, wherein these crafts were written in Greek. Hermenes, that was the son of Cush, and Cush was the son unto Shem, who was the son unto Noah. The same Hermenes was afterwards called Hermes, the father of wise men. And he found out the two pillars of stone wherein the sciences were written and taught them forth. This is what the Gothic manuscript says is the foundation of Freemasonry, craft masonry in Europe. It is the same story that the Druze tell as that their founding. How is that even possible? The only way that's possible is through the Templars making this connection. And of course, it's emphasizing Hermes. The next place, the second oldest document that we find associated with the craft, we find in Scotland. It's known as the Shaw Statutes, published the same time, by the way, as the Neometria in Germany. And in it, it specifically talks about the Hermetic art of memory, which was an idea being populated by Giordano Bruno, who was also studying these Hermetic ideas that were coming back from the Druze that had been brought into Europe by the Templars before they were suppressed. So in both of the earliest documents of Freemasonry, we're talking about this Hermetic tradition, this Gnostic tradition that the Templars inherited from the Druze, and of which have continued to be passed down in Masonry to this day in different forms. So that it is my belief, my opinion, that you cannot understand the origins of Freemasonry without looking at this connection with the Templars and who they were associating with and what they brought back to Europe. And all of it has symbolic meaning that's left for you to understand and to work through. But brethren, in my opinion, the Masonic order, just based on all this stuff and more you can read about in John J. Robinson, is the inheritors of the Templar tradition after it was suppressed. And we continue to pass it on today. So that is all I got. Thanks. Good.
All right. Brother, I want to thank you all for attending this lecture with the brother Tim. What an amazing journey it has been.